The wind was silent. Even the ravens, usually screaming above the Tower of London, had vanished. There she stood small, almost weightless in her frame, her breath steady, her chin slightly lifted. Anne Boleyn, once Queen of England, now knelt in the center of a scaffold, drenched in the gray light of May. Her hair was gone, tucked beneath a linen coif. Her hands, which had once stroked the silk banners of France and clasped Henry's trembling fingers during coronation, now clutched a small prayer book. The crimson beneath her gray gown was no accident. She had chosen martyr's colors. The crowd surrounding her held their breath. No one spoke. The sword had not yet been drawn. The French executioner stood barefoot behind her, silent. He had trained to kill quickly. No block, no sound, only steel. Anne knew that. She had been told. She had accepted it. It is the stillness that haunts historians more than the blow. Her stillness, her readiness. There are no reports of begging, no last-minute collapse. Anne Boleyn did not plead. She did not scream. And that's the horror. How did this woman, England's crowned queen, mother to a future monarch, once adored by a king who tore his country apart for her, end up here, blinking softly into a clouded sky, her neck exposed to a blade summoned before her trial had even begun? We remember her as the victim, or the witch, or the temptress. But that morning she was something else entirely. She was prepared. Anne was born not to rule, but to orbit the court. Sharp-eyed and sharp-tongued, she became the woman who captured the king's obsession and redefined the crown itself. She had once walked into grand feasts and turned every neck. Her French training, her quick wit, her refusal to be anyone's mistress. These weren't just traits, they were threats. When Henry VIII first saw her, she refused him. She gave him silence. She wrote letters with no ink, and in that resistance he found something divine. He cast away a queen for her, defied the Pope, split Christendom, and for a brief, dangerous moment, Anne Boleyn was the sun. But power is not love. It devours, then forgets. The moment she gave Henry a daughter instead of a son, that sun began to set, slowly, painfully, like a candle suffocating under glass. The court turned. Whispers grew in dark corners. Her former allies stepped back. Henry's eyes wandered to a pale, quiet woman named Jane Seymour. By the spring of 1536, the queen who had redefined English monarchy was reduced to rumors. Hysterical laughter, failed pregnancies, sharp words spoken at the wrong moment. She had miscarried in January. By April, she was surrounded by enemies. Still, Anne held her head high. Even when Henry's council summoned her, even when they locked her in the tower, even when her brother was arrested, she didn't cry. She asked for pen and paper. She asked where her daughter was. What she didn't know was that her executioner had already been summoned, days before the trial, before any sentence had been passed. That's where the horror truly begins. On May 18th, the night before her death, Anne was said to be calm. Too calm. She joked with her attendants. She laughed. One of the guards said she seemed joyous. Another claimed she wept, prayed, then smiled again. "She hath much joy and pleasure in death," Sir William Kingston wrote. Joy? No, it was something else. There's a moment when terror burns itself out, when grief becomes stillness. Anne had reached it. She had gone beyond fear. When she walked to the scaffold the next morning, it was not with pride, but with purpose. She spoke only to God and the crowd. Her voice was clear. Her words were obedient. She thanked Henry. She praised his mercy, not because she meant it, but because she knew he was listening. And then she knelt, hands folded, eyes open. The sword was still hidden behind the executioner's back. A whisper of steel, a breath. But everything changed after the sound of that step. It didn't happen overnight. Rot never does. Anne Boleyn's crown didn't fall. It cracked. It began with silence. From Henry, from the courtiers, from the rooms that once trembled with her laughter. Her power had never been built on stability. It was desire turned law, rebellion dressed as royalty. And as soon as that desire faded, so did her safety. In January 1536, Anne suffered her final miscarriage. A boy too soon born, the child that could have secured her place forever. Some say it happened after a heated argument with the king. Others whisper she found Jane Seymour's locket, a miniature of Henry inside, and snapped it from his neck before collapsing. What mattered wasn't the cause, it was the loss, and it was total. That morning, Henry didn't grieve. He turned his back. The woman he had once rewritten the laws of God for was now a burden. Anne knew. She wasn't naive. She understood court rhythm. She could feel the cold smiles, the slowed bows, the way her ladies whispered when they thought she slept. She had seen Henry do this before, to Catherine, to Wolsey, to anyone who disappointed him. But Anne had one fatal flaw. She thought she was different. She had given him the Reformation, a daughter with fire in her blood, years of devotion. Surely he would not do this. But he already had. In early May 1536, Henry gave permission for Thomas Cromwell, his shadow, his knife, to begin investigations. The charges were vague: adultery, incest, treason. So vague they barely made sense. Anne, the Queen of England, was accused of sleeping with 5 men, including her own brother. The court did not question it. They didn't need to. They needed to obey. The arrests began quickly. Mark Smeaton, the court musician, George Boleyn, her brother, Henry Norris, one of the king's oldest friends. One by one, they were dragged away, interrogated, tortured, pressed into confessions. Mark Smeaton was the only one to confess, likely under the threat of the rack. Anne was arrested on May 2nd. While watching a game of tennis, she was summoned. Her smile didn't falter. She walked from the court to the tower without crying, but once inside, the cracks deepened. Sir Kingston, the tower constable, wrote that she seemed distraught, then calm, then cheerful again. She laughed aloud one moment, then covered her face in silence. A pattern, always the same: fear, prayer, stillness, laughter. But what terrified her more than death was the names: George, Smeaton, Norris, Weston, Brereton. Men she had known, some she had trusted, one her brother. She had asked for paper to write to Henry. The letter was never delivered. Instead, she was left with her ladies, spies in silk, who reported every word she said back to Cromwell. One night she whispered, "Shall I die without justice?" It was not a question. Outside the tower, England buzzed with quiet dread. Few spoke her name, fewer defended it. Jane Seymour, pale and obedient, was already receiving royal gifts. Henry had moved on before the trial even began. He laughed at dinners, he joked with advisors. He ordered the scaffold built. Even Anne's enemies were shocked at the speed. The trial took place on May 15th. She was brought in wearing a black gown, her face calm, eyes defiant. Her father watched from the audience. Her uncle passed sentence. Her brother stood accused beside her. The outcome was already written. The sword had already been summoned from Calais days before the verdict. On the morning of May 17th, her brother was executed. She heard the cannon fire from her cell. That night, she spoke softly to herself, as if preparing for a dinner, not a death. The women around her described her as glowing, serene. But one guard said she was whispering names in the dark. Names of the men who had fallen, names of those who watched in silence. Anne's rot was not just physical, it was political, it was personal, it was public. She had become a ghost while still alive, a queen in name, a traitor on paper, and a memory already fading from her husband's eyes. When the sun rose on May 19th, she knew what it meant. She had dreamed it. She had rehearsed it. She was ready. But readiness does not remove fear. The sword had been sharpened, the scaffold raised, the veil laid out, and Anne had one night left to wait. The Tower of London was cold that May, the kind of cold that crept up through stone and bone. Not harsh, just lingering, like something waiting. Anne had been there before. In 1533, she arrived through the Traitor's Gate as queen in waiting to prepare for her coronation. Trumpets, crowds, petals beneath her feet. Now she was here again, alone, caged, but she walked the same halls, slept under the same beams, and every night she whispered to the stones as if they might remember her glory. She began speaking more softly, not always to the people in the room, sometimes to God, sometimes to herself, sometimes to someone no one else could see. The tower staff grew uneasy. One guard said she was too calm, and when she laughed, it made the others flinch. Another reported that she spoke to her daughter through the walls, called out for Elizabeth in the dark. "You must remember me. They will not write my name." There were days she refused food. Nights she hummed hymns to herself and stood motionless by the window, as if waiting for a sign from the sky. She practiced where her head would fall. She asked Kingston if her eyes would remain open after death. She made jokes, then begged for a priest, then wept. She asked how the French sword would feel. "Will it burn?" Sir Kingston said nothing. The scaffold was ready by the 18th. So was the swordsman. The execution was delayed. Henry hadn't signed the final order. And I knew why. He was waiting for a better omen. Or perhaps waiting to be sure Jane Seymour's womb would hold. That night, her last night, she didn't sleep. She stayed awake beneath a candle that flickered until dawn. Two ladies sat beside her, pretending to stitch, but really just watching. Anne prayed, then smiled, then prayed again. She said she saw her mother. She said she saw George. She asked the room to be cleaned. She didn't want to die in a dirty place. Then without warning, she laughed. Not loudly, just hollow. I heard a bell. That means the king is eating. He always eats well. No one responded. At sunrise, a crow landed on the scaffold. The executioner saw it first. He took off his boots, polished his blade. He had done this before, but never for a queen. Anne walked out in gray and red. No crown, no jewels, no pride, just peace. She asked not to be blindfolded. She wanted to see it. They denied her request. Before kneeling, she gave a final speech. It was short, too short. A few lines to the people. I die a faithful woman to the king. God save his grace. She did not name Jane. She did not name Henry. She did not name the sword. She kneeled on the straw, folded her hands, waited. The executioner stood behind her, blade hidden. He raised one hand and called for his assistant. Anne turned her head, just slightly, and that was the moment. The sword sang through the air. It was fast, so fast, and then it was over. Witnesses said her lips moved after her head fell, as if she was still praying. Others said her body collapsed gracefully, as if she had rehearsed it. There was no scream, no gasp, just silence. A silence that made the court tremble more than any cry. The ladies rushed forward, covered her head, wrapped her body. There was no coffin. They used an old arrow chest. Her body folded to fit. Some say a drop of blood remained on the scaffold for weeks. Others say the tower grew colder afterward and stayed that way. I wonder, did she feel the pain? Or just the shame? Did she die thinking of Elizabeth? Or Henry? Or nothing at all? We cannot ask her. But the stones remember. The sword remembers. The silence remembers. And yet, death was not the end. The wind didn't change when she died. The tower stayed silent. But something deep and permanent had shifted. Anne Boleyn, once the most powerful woman in England, had been executed without a crowd's roar, without her daughter's eyes, and without a proper coffin. She was carried headless and wrapped in white linen by the same women who had once dressed her for coronations. They laid her body inside an old elm arrow chest. The lid did not fit. Her knees had to be bent to close it. There was no ceremony, no hymns, no court mourning. Just quiet steps down to the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula. St. Peter in chains? There, without a name carved, without a stone laid, they placed her in the earth. A shallow grave for a queen. Above, the court had already moved on. Jane Seymour wore brighter colors now. The palace halls no longer echoed with Anne's sharp voice or foreign laughter. Henry VIII, upon hearing the cannon that signaled her death, immediately boarded his barge and sailed to Jane. He smiled. He wore white. The marriage preparations began that same day. It had only been hours since Anne's blood hit the straw. But London whispered, not loud, not brave, but whispered, that she had been innocent, that she had been sacrificed for a son, that she had died too calmly, that her ghost now stood in the tower's north wall, whispering prayers no one could understand. Years passed. The arrow chest was forgotten, the grave covered, Anne's name erased from portraits. Her daughter Elizabeth declared illegitimate, but the rot Anne had once feared spread further. Catherine Howard, beheaded. Jane Grey, beheaded. Thomas More, beheaded. Wives, scholars, nobles, all silenced in time. The blade had learned its way through royal skin, and it never forgot the path. But the ghost of Anne Boleyn didn't vanish. In 1558, her daughter rose to power. Queen Elizabeth Thurthermarn. The daughter Henry barely acknowledged. The girl Anne had prayed for during her trial. She ruled for 44 years. She refused to marry. She stood taller than any man who doubted her. And on her finger, beneath her gloves, she wore a ring. A locket hidden inside, with a portrait of Anne. Anne Boleyn had been erased from history by kings. But she returned through queens. Through power redefined. Through legacy made unkillable. She had no gravestone for centuries. No monument. Just a legend. And then roses began to appear. Each year, someone left flowers on the stones of St. Peter ad Vincula. Red, silent, fragrant. No note. No signature. Just the scent of memory. In 1876, a marble plaque was finally laid for her. But by then, her story had already become more than memory. It had become myth. And myth survives more deeply than law. Imagine her final moment once more. A soft wind on the scaffold. A queen kneeling without chains. A sword hidden just behind her. A whisper. I die a faithful woman to the king. And then silence. But even silence carries weight. In the tower's halls today, some say they still hear her footsteps, or her breath behind the chapel door. One guard claimed he saw a woman in gray walk across Tower Green and vanish near the spot where the scaffold once stood. He quit the next morning. Her story is not just one of betrayal. It is a story of transformation. From mistress to queen, from queen to traitor, from traitor to ghost, from ghost to legend. And all of it began with love and ended with steel.